1, 2, 1, 2.
There, now.
I'll be here all day.
Councilmember Jordan.
Here.
Councilmember Snedden.
Here.
Chair Oscar Gutierrez.
Present.
Thank you.
Let the minutes reflect that we are all present. Ms. Clerk, are there any changes to the agenda?
Chair Gutierrez, there are no changes to the agenda.
Do we have any cards for public comment on matters that are not on the agenda today?
Chair Gutierrez, we do not have anybody online or in person who would like to make public comment for items not on the agenda.
Okay, thank you. May we have the reading of the first agenda item, please?
Subject, Local Housing Trust Fund.
Okay, may we have the staff report, please?
Thank you, Chair Gutierrez and members of the Ordinance Committee. I am going to be giving the staff presentation today. And next slide, please. So the recommendation for today would be that the Ordinance Committee consider establishing a local housing trust fund, that you direct staff to agendize the matter before the Finance Committee to consider a dedicated source of funding for both the ongoing source of revenue and the matching funds as required by the HCD regulations, and that once that's done, you return to the Ordinance Committee to consider an ordinance that we will have drafted, and at that point, if you approve the ordinance, that you move that on to City Council. Next slide, please. So the background, as you will, next slide. The background, as you will recall, on June 28th, 2023, the Ordinance Committee was considering a draft ordinance to create a HOPE Fund, and as part of that consideration, the committee asked for further information to consider creating a local housing trust fund. At that time, my office requested further information on the creation and the requirements of a local housing trust fund, and we're here to present that to you today. Next slide, please. So a local housing trust fund is actually a matching fund program that was created by the state legislature and administrated by the state HCD, and it's a program to support the local creation or preservation of affordable housing. It's established through the Health and Safety Code section 50842.1. Sorry, next slide, please. So there's a series of regulations that really set out what the requirements for the local housing trust fund are, and I've set those out in the memorandum that I attached to the staff report, and I'll just go through those today with you. Next slide, please. So essentially, a local housing trust fund is a joint public and private, or a charitable nonprofit 501c3 organization, which is created by the legislature, and if it's created as through a public entity, it must be established by ordinance, which is what we would do if we considered to establish the local housing trust fund. Local housing trust funds created through the HUD regulations, the HCD regulations, are either new and existing, and that's an important distinction because the requirements differ between the two. Obviously, the City of Santa Barbara fund would be a new fund since we have not previously received funding. The city, if it did establish a local housing trust fund, it would be obligated to operate and fund the housing trust fund for a minimum of 5 years. Next slide, please. So a local housing trust fund that is created by ordinance, one of the requirements that you, in order to submit applications for funding, the minimum application per project is $500,000, and the maximum is up to $5 million. So one of the there are two really important key requirements in terms of funding, and that is that you must dedicate an ongoing source of revenue from any dedicated source. And that is to support program operations. So for a new local housing trust fund, the definition is that you have to have sufficient dedicated funds for ongoing revenue to support operating costs. For existing local housing trust funds, that equals about $100,000 a year. So, we can just kind of benchmark around there, but there's no actual defined amount of money that HCD will require, but it just has to support existing operations. So to carry out the program costs. Next slide, please. So the key component to this is that the local agency has to provide matching funds for each program, each project that you apply for program funds. So, and as I mentioned, the minimum application is $500,000, which would mean for each project application, we would have to have matching funds in the amount of at least $500,000. So the key to matching funds is that they can be taxes, fees, loan repayments, PLHA funds, in lieu fees, or any combination of that, but they cannot come from funds that are already restricted by state or federal law to housing. So that would be home funds, CDBG funds, or former redevelopment agency low and moderate income housing funds. Matching funds must be on deposit or legally committed at the time the application for funding is submitted. So as I said before, in order to qualify, you have to have a minimum of $500,000 matching funds on deposit. Next slide, please. So, and as I said, matching funds can come from any combination of sources, including land donations, the contribution that the city council already made in the amount of $2.8 million to the local housing trust fund, if one were established, would qualify for a matching fund. Next slide, please. So here's a little table which outlines what would be eligible matching funds, what would not be eligible matching funds. So just to go through it again, in lieu fees from our in lieu fee program would be eligible matching funds. PLHA funds would be eligible, general fund allocation, TOT, sales tax, one-time donation. Ineligible would be home funds, community development block grants, former redevelopment, low and moderate income housing, or state CDB, or state HCD housing program. Next slide, please. Continuing on with what the requirements are, one of the key requirements for us would be that we would have to have an adopted housing element that is found to be in compliance with the state housing element law at the time of application. And also you have to have your annual progress reports prepared within the preceding 12 months. So, obviously we don't meet that requirement at this time. So in consultation with the Community Development Department, they anticipate that we will have our housing element approved by the end of the year, which would be very advantageous for us because if that were so and we adopted and put in place a new housing trust fund, we would be able to qualify for spring 2024 housing cycle. Under the legislation, new housing trust funds are entitled to set-aside funds, and in the spring 2024 cycle, their HCD is anticipating a 15% set-aside. So we would be entitled to this bump up of funds. So, would be really great if we could qualify for this increased set-aside funds if we did get our housing element approved by the end of the year. So I think that, this would be added impetus for us to get this approved. Next slide, please. Additional requirements, and this is what the fund monies can be used for. So it's pretty restricted. Construction or permanent finance lending. So the loans can be made for pre-development, cannot be, and permanent financing, right? Cannot be used for vacant land acquisition, so no land banking is allowed. you have to have a development project with that. Loans cannot exceed 3% simple interest per annum, but that's typically what we do now. So that's really, on par with how we typically do our lending for affordable housing projects. Administrative expenses, up to 5% of program funds, up to 5% of matching funds. So cannot exceed 5% for administrative expenses. Next slide, please. Affordable housing restrictions, very restrictive as to affordability requirements. What you do is you take the administrative expenses off the top, and what is left after that, at least 30% of program funds must be restricted to extremely low income. That's 30% AMI and below. No more than 20% program funds shall be restricted to moderate income. The remaining funds may be expended on lower income, so 80% of AMI. So, really pretty restrictive in terms of income eligibility. Next slide, please. Types of projects that can be funded: rental units with affordability restricted to no less than 55 years. We would apply our typical 90-year covenant to this. So we would go above and beyond this requirement, I would imagine. Emergency shelter, transitional housing, permanent supportive housing, home buyer, for sale home buyer, which is something that in the past we did, haven't done it recently, but that would be an eligible use under the program, ADU programs, junior ADU programs. Next slide. We did receive an alternative proposal from the Housing Trust Fund of Santa Barbara County, which is a nonprofit 501c3 program. They've been operating in the county since 2004. They receive funds from HCD under their program. They submitted a request for us. They'd be willing to partner with us, where the city could put our funding into their program if the city wanted to do something where we didn't create our own fund, but instead put our money into their fund. Something that to consider. Thought we would bring that forward to you if you wanted to consider that proposal. Next slide. So the next steps, and I know I went through this kind of quickly, so you may have some questions. The next steps would be, as I said before, next slide, Laura, would be to forward this to the Finance Committee, where I'll go through this with them. We need to identify a dedicated source of funding, again, to pay for the operating costs for 5 years, and that can come from any source. That doesn't need to be restricted. It can come from the low and moderate income housing fund. It can come from, funds that are restricted for housing. So it can come from any source, looking at probably $100,000 a year. And then we need to identify those matching sources, which again are matching funds, which again are funds that that cannot be restricted to housing by state or federal law. And again, that can be the 2.8 that council's already put into the fund, plus whatever else, sales tax, TOT, general plan, whatever those sources of funding the council would want to consider. So once we get to Finance Committee, they consider funding sources. We would want to return to Ordinance Committee with a proposed ordinance. Really, the ordinance just creates the fund, sets out the parameters like we've discussed. Ordinance Committee hopefully approves that ordinance and suggests it move on to council for final adoption. Any questions? Sorry, that was probably too fast. And that would be my recommendation.
My colleagues have any questions? I see Councilmember Mike Jordan has one.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's like world record speed for
Sorry,
something
I
that's so simple,
apologize.
right? I have a bunch. I'll apologize in advance. So public, joint public, private and public, or charitable? Does it have to be one of those? It's not all of those at the same time?
You would not want, it could be a combination of those. It could be regional.
Okay.
And it could be a combination, but that would probably get a little difficult to
We're talking
administer.
about a public one?
Most of them, if you look at your staff report, at the back of it, I have a list of public agencies, counties, cities. I think that is, but there are also, like our county county trust fund, which is a 501c3. So I don't know of any combinations.
So if you're public and you had a scenario where a group of employers who employ low-wage earners wanted to participate in the donation
Yep.
process, is that a tax-advantaged donation to them, or does the trust fund have to be a 501c3 trust fund?
Well, I know that we can accept donations from private entities into our fund.
Okay.
Whether or not they would receive a tax benefit for that, I cannot answer that question. I can find out for you,
So I
though.
think the scenario I would pose is, if it's a public, is it tax advantaged? And if it's not, is there even a future scenario where you could see having two of these? You would have one that's public, and we would have one looking into the future saying there's low-income wage employer groups out there that would form a consortium and be willing to donate to that one. If it was, certainly if it was tax advantage, that would be the carrot, right? That'd be my
Correct.
question.
Right, I can find out more
Okay.
about that scenario.
And then with the $500,000 application and then the matching funds of $500,000, that means any project is a minimum 1 million project, is that correct?
You have to have dollar-for-dollar matching, so, and the minimum application
But you
is,
have to spend that $500,000 as each of those $500,000 as a project, or do you just put that in there as your starting
you put it.
bucket of money, and then you could do smaller or larger funds, right?
Yeah, I think that's your starting bucket.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then do you have any idea on, somebody could speak to this perhaps when they do public comment, on the application to wherever this is up in the state, to approval, to the funds appearing, and to construction timeline? So what do you commit? So you got the money, but what do you, I'll just draw an analogy. I mean, we've got the money on paper for the Cliff Drive project. We're not starting construction until 2027, which is like a lifetime to some of us this old.
Yeah.
So I'm just wondering, somebody in the audience may know that too, but I'd just be curious then, you know, how long are you really waiting for your money to actually do something in that scenario?
There is a limitation on how long you can hold the money before you have to actually start the project, and I can find that.
More of mine is like, how long's the state tying you up in your application
Oh,
and
the
approval and
to get through the-
consideration, and then, and whatever takes place there?
Yeah, to get through the process, I
Yep.
don't know the
I
answer to that.
suspect
but-
somebody might know sitting out there. And is there just one annual cycle? You mentioned the spring 2024 cycle. Is there only one annual cycle per year?
Yeah, another question, I don't know if there's
Okay.
more than one.
And then
There
I
may be
don't
two.
understand by the set aside that's in.
Yeah, the
So if
set
you're doing
aside,
if you're doing $1 million project and you're matching with $1 million for a $2 million project, the state is going to give you an extra 15%?
no, they said, that by statute, the statute provides that there's a certain, so the state allocates certain funding to this program, and in the legislation, it says that from this allocation, a certain percentage of that is set aside to be allocated to new funds.
Okay.
So in this coming cycle, it's 15% of that funding is allocated to new funds.
Going to have a question for Eli, but I'll wait. Let me just walk through these because I think the rest are for Sarah. On the list of types of project, are the for sale, home buyer, and ADUs and junior ADUs also affordable, capital A affordable? So in terms of the ADUs, that would be a homeowner building an ADU who would commit to the income levels, the rent rate, and for the period of 55 years.
Yeah, and I'm not sure how the program would work for the ADUs. For the home buyer, it would be a development, you know, that had, was a home buyer development, right? For the ADUs, I don't know exactly how that would work. It's just in the regulations that allow for them. So we would obviously need further information on
Okay.
that.
I have a few more. That was my first set of sheets. Can your projects be outside city limits?
No.
Okay. Can you partner with your trust fund with another trust fund to do joint projects together?
Would it be inside the city limits?
If it has to be.
If it would be inside the city limits. So
Yeah.
I think we could partner, say, with the
Okay.
county trust fund. They could probably invest funding into that. But if it was an eligible project, since that was a regional fund,
Right, like a county
we
fund.
might want to ask.
I'm just assuming.
Yeah, I
We're in
would
the county
think-
too.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right.
And then can you, what I would call mixed housing types, can you do a project with a private partner where half of it is qualifying for the trust fund, half of it is something else entirely, whether it's market rate or above the 120, and where our part of the project is only allocating our funds for the applicable units, but it's all one project?
Yeah, I think so. I think you
Okay.
could. As long as the lending were, it was segregated. Again, some of these, I don't have.
I've never been known to get down in the
100%.
weeds, have I?
But
No, I agree. So I think that might be my last one, but let me check. And then, nope, hang on. And can you direct funds to the trust fund at any time? Or does that have to be an annual obligation here? Or in theory, could you be halfway through your budget year, and you only got so much money in the bucket, and a funding opportunity comes up, and then, just to use an obscene example, you could go to your reserves and say, boom, send some money over to the trust fund from your reserves to make a project work?
for the matching funds,
Right.
you could do that. For this dedicated source of fundings, you need to have a dedicated source of funding that continually, supports that fund. But
Okay.
matching funds, you need to,
Yep.
show those funds in there when you apply.
Yep, perfect.
It's my understanding.
All right. One of the elephants in the room for me, Eli, is the approval of the housing element. And so I would just ask you how confident you are that when the housing element comes back to council sometime in the winter, that it's actually going to be approved. I say that looking back on participation in the housing element, where it was pretty much walked through the process because of the application date. I want to say it was like less than a month between when it was at council and when it was there, and there were plenty of concerns with the contents of the housing element, but we were pummeled by the application date. Well, that doesn't matter, because here we are a year later still working on it. And then I think there's also then this, whatever timeline or leverage it has to have to get back to us and what you've been working on, and then get back to them. This places another timeline on it, and just my memory is, whether it was at Planning Commission or at Council, there was lots of concern on the content of the housing element at that time, and some consternation that we were being forced to move it through because of timelines and short timelines. So I don't know, how do you, it's just kind of, I see this going in the same direction, and I'm just wondering where we are or what's happening.
Thank you, Chair Gutierrez, Committee Member Jordan. So we are currently scheduled to bring the housing element forward to the council for adoption on December 12th. Prior to that, it will be going to Planning Commission. We are working really closely with HCD right now, and those conversations are going really well. We're zeroing in on sort of the last remaining items that we've received feedback from them, making progress there. And so our intention is to bring it forward on the 12th with a letter of support from HCD. If that can happen, we might bring it forward without that letter of support, but it will see Planning Commission for their feedback and then bring it to council on the 12th. And we really see that date as being critical for all the reasons we're discussing today. We really want to make sure that we have a housing element certified in time for this round of funding that we're anticipating in the spring. As Ms. Connect mentioned, when we met with HCD about a month ago, they mentioned that there is a set aside of the larger pot of trust fund monies dedicated to specifically new housing trust funds. And so we want to make sure that we're in a position where we can access some of those funds.
So I'll just sneak in a comment of uneasiness, and that is December 12th, I think, is the last day we meet for a month. We don't meet again until the second week of January. And so if there are unsettled opinions, either at Planning Commission or at Council, at that time you're building zero opportunity in to discuss those, which is sort of my recollection of how we got to right now already. I guess my 2 cents would be if there's anything you do to start setting up individual or small group meetings with both planning commissioners and, two-person meetings with planning commissioners and council members, I think that time would be well spent, not to avoid the pushback that you might see by being tasked with absolutely having to approve it on the 12th regardless of input. So does that make sense?
Chair Gutierrez, Councilmember Jordan, that makes perfect sense. I think we hope to be in a position to start bringing in Planning Commission and Council on the final version of the housing element here in the next few weeks. As I said, we're working really closely with HCD right now to round out the sort of last set of comments we received from them. At that time, I think it would be appropriate to start holding the meetings you suggest, two-person meetings with
Just I guess a
PC.
final thought. Something that's in agreement with staff and HCD does not necessarily mean it's something in agreement with the people that have to approve it. I mean, you've seen that before. I've seen it before. You've seen it before. And that's the December 12th meltdown that I'm hoping to avoid. Right? Okay, thanks. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Councilmember Jordan. Councilmember Sneddon.
Thank you, Chair Gutierrez. Before I ask questions, just thank you for looking deeply into this and bringing it back to us as an affordable housing trust fund. And I know a lot of work went into that, and I really appreciate it. I'm going to ask my questions in the order of the staff or the memorandum. Just starting, I guess it's page 3, and the potential matching funds. So this is sort of a list of possibilities. Would these be permanent allocations, or do we suggest permanent allocations, or is it updated? How often would that be updated, or what is your recommendation on that?
My recommendation, Councilmember Sneddon, is that we start with an allocation, at least the 2.8 that the council's already allocated, and maybe add to that, and then at a regular interval, add to that.
Okay.
That would, I would think that would be a good way to get it started.
Get it started.
Yeah.
And then to Councilmember Jordan's question too, we could make adjustments to additional allocations after that point.
Yes.
Okay. Okay.
We would need to.
Yeah.
We would need to. for
And
the matching
will
funds.
finance be looking at that? Will they be refining sort of which one of these or all of these, or how that will be funding?
That would be my hope.
Okay.
I think they're the appropriate committee to look at where the best and most available sources are.
Great. And then, I guess I won't ask this too much, but with the housing element update, since we have an acting housing element, is that not in compliance while the other one is pending? So we're just in free float right now. Okay, I won't ask. Thank you. Okay, I saw the head nod. Then to the second part, the using of the LHTF funds. So I had a question about land banking. does this count as being allowed or not allowed if the city owned the land and say the housing authority or some other entity owned the building and it was built with these funds? Does that count as land banking or not?
Councilmember Sutton, that would be more of a project if we wanted to consider a construction loan. A construction loan is an allowable use. So a construction loan to, say, the housing authority to redevelop what was on that property, even though the city owned the property, would be an allowable use.
Thank
That
you.
wouldn't be land banking. Land banking is, oh, there's a vacant piece of property there, we just want to buy it for some future opportunity.
So we still could use other funds to do something like land banking, but it couldn't come from this fund?
Absolutely, we could use low and moderate income housing funds for that.
Okay, thank you. And then on that next page with the 30% and the 20% and the 120%, if you could just, I don't know, comment on that. Is the 120%, which I'm good with, is that what the state law or the requirements of this fund, that's how it's delineated up to the 120%?
Councilmember Sutton, that is how it's delineated in the state law. So we must comply with those minimum requirements. We can not use, if we meet the minimum requirements for the fund in the program, right, and get the funding, and we have additional monies, we can use those for over and above other things, right, that are not limited to that minimum as set forth in the statute.
Okay, got it.
But we must comply with those, how the affordability is delineated in the statute.
Okay, thank you. And it lines up with how we've prioritized, so I think that's fine. And then the types of projects, this has the covenant listed as 55 years. Could we make that 90?
It says at least 55, so I'm assuming and would be, I'm quite sure that we could use our 90-year covenant.
Okay. And then in parentheses there, it says no rental assistance, and I'm just not sure what that meant.
So why I put that in there is because this program is for construction, rehabilitation, those kinds of lending opportunities. It's not for programmatic uses. So,
Any programmatic
any
uses,
programmatic
okay.
uses like loan, rental assistance or right to counsel, those kinds of things that we had been considering as part of the HOPE Fund, and that we do, as part of our housing program, we do those programmatic. This program would not be for those types of uses. So, and we're not discussing that today, but, we will still have our funding sources like CDBG, home funds, low and moderate income funds that aren't eligible for this program. So we still can consider the HOPE Fund for those funds, right? And we can use, those funds for the programmatic programs that we still want to fund, like the right to counsel that we've already allocated those $250,000 to. We still want to do that, but not as part of this.
Okay, thank you. And so then you
I
mentioned.
mean, I'm assuming we still want to do it,
Yeah.
speaking for you.
I think we
Yeah.
do. We still want to do that. Because that was going to be my next question, too, about if those allocated funds are still going to be available for right to counsel.
Absolutely, yes.
And then you mentioned the HOPE Fund. Are we still going to have a HOPE Fund?
Well, so that's a different conversation.
Okay.
Put that on hold for now while we go forward with this. But if the commission wants to, we will bring that back. Once this gets on its way, bring that back to consider, putting those funds that we can't use for this into that.
So those programs or rental assistance or right to counsel, those, okay.
Exactly.
Okay, thank you. And then the for sale home buyer, how does that work?
Yeah, well, in years past, we did have programs, condominiums, for affordable home buyer programs.
So they would have to be affordable, and it would have to be something like a condominium.
condominium.
This isn't
Or people, Habitat for Humanity does for sale, low, moderate income for sale home buying programs. So those are the kinds of things that I think are anticipated by that.
Okay, so not just any home buying.
No, not
Okay.
market rate home buying. No, this is very restricted.
Want to be sure.
Yeah.
And then for the ADUs and junior ADUs, similar questions. So this is on private property, and then if it changes hands, does the next owner need to honor that covenant, or how? This one seems sticky to me.
Yeah, Councilmember Sense, so all the regulations say is funds may be used for the construction, conversion, repair, reconstruction, or rehabilitation of accessory dwelling units or junior accessory dwelling units. So it doesn't provide any further detail on that, but we would obviously want to have a conversation with the HCD reps and kind of get more clarity on what would be permitted use for that.
Okay.
If we wanted to even do it, so.
Yeah, at
But,
first,
but obviously, they would be subject to the affordability requirements, so how would we covenant that? How would be, what kind of program are they thinking about there? But I wanted to include that because it's part of what the regs allow for.
okay, so we would go into more detail on that at a later time, because that one is sticky.
Absolutely. Yeah,
Okay.
when we come back with our ordinance, hopefully we'll flesh those out a little bit more, be able to provide more detail on that.
And then would a loan for a first-time home buyer of affordable, would that be not usable funds from this fund, but that could be something from a different
Correct.
programmatic
Right.
funding? Okay.
Mhm.
Okay, thank you, it's really helpful. And then, could you comment on the proposal from the county? I'm not seeing advantages there, but if I'm missing something on what advantages there might be that I'm not seeing.
Well, so administratively, it would probably be simpler. We would just, and we would have a fair amount of control into where those funds went in terms of lending and underwriting and that kind of thing. And we would be able to ensure probably where and what programs those funds were used for. And as I said, administratively. But it wouldn't be our program. Funds wouldn't come to us. But I guess those would be the advantages.
Thank you. So I just wanted to, I'm in favor of keeping it as a city program. And then I just wanted, my last question, is the proposed name City of Santa Barbara Local Housing Trust Fund? Is that the proposed name, or do we have a proposed name?
I think it's up to you.
Okay, I like that one. So, okay, thank you.
Thank you. I had all my questions answered by you all asking them for me, so thank you for that. Do we have any speaker slips on this item?
Chair Gutierrez, we do. We have no one online who would like to speak, so we'll take in-person speakers. Our first speaker will be Leslie Wiscombe.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair and members of the Ordinance Committee. First, I would just like to express my gratitude to staff for the very hard work they've done in presenting this Local Housing Trust Fund proposal. It's greatly improved from the original Hope Fund proposal that we all saw a while back for this particular purpose. And if approved and established, our city will join the ranks of many other jurisdictions who have HCD-approved trust funds that may compete up to, as Ms. Connect said, $5 million per project in matching funds. And I just want to give you a few points to consider during your deliberations. As you know, the fund will require a dedicated source of income. And I hope you will support the Housing Authority's initial prioritization of inclusionary in lieu fees as a source of income. And I further hope that the committee recommends to the Finance Committee consideration of options for dedicated funding, such as TOT or sales tax. I'm confident that a significant population of our community will support a dedicated source of funds for affordable housing. And to get to one of Councilmember Jordan's questions, annually in 2021 and 2022, HCD awarded approximately $8.5 million to new local housing trust funds, which if we get our housing element done, then we can apply for that, and $48 million to existing ones. And in 2022 alone, HCD awarded 18 jurisdictional trust funds with an average of $3.15 million in matching funds for projects. So they've been doing $56 million a year for the last 2 years, which are the only years I looked at. Additionally, City Council's allocation of $2.88 million plus interest should be transferred into the trust fund as soon as it's established. And although we have an invitation from the county to join their Affordable Housing Trust Fund, I think it's imperative that the city retains local control of our trust fund in order to maximize its success with the city of Santa Barbara and with our affordable housing partners, such as our city's housing authority. And we talked about the housing element. I won't go into that. In closing, I just like to accept staff's recommendation as outlined to establish the local housing trust fund, forward a recommendation to the finance committee to consider a dedicated source of funding, and return to the ordinance committee with a draft ordinance for your review. And thank you so much for all your work and consideration.
Our next speaker is Rob Fredericks.
Good afternoon, Chair Gutierrez and committee members. What Ms. Wiscombe said, thank you. I mean, she actually encapsulated everything that I would have wanted to say on this trust fund. First and foremost, thank you to our city partners, city attorney, and all of you for moving on this path for setting up the local housing trust fund. As has been explained, it can be established by simple resolution establishing through that ordinance a trust fund following the state's guidelines. We do advocate that the $2.8 million that the council directed back last December be put into this trust fund initially, and then for a short-term ongoing dedicated source, the in lieu inclusionary fees, even though it's a small amount, it'll help us until we can find that proper revenue generating source for a larger ongoing fund. Lastly, I do want to say that with the proposal by the county trust fund, I agree with Ms. Wiscombe. It needs to stay within the city of Santa Barbara auspices. It's the city's money, the city's developments, and for transparency, I think those developments need to go through Finance Committee for funding and then on to City Council for the ultimate decision. Lastly, I will say that we've had experience with the use of certain restrictions like the no land banking or use of the how much time do you get between obligation and expenditure of the funds. Bradley Studios is a good example. We purchased the land with RDA funds, but in that loan agreement, we had 5 years to get our entitlements approved and to begin construction. Otherwise, those funds would be due and payable back to the city. So I believe it's 5 years. I'm sure Ms. Connect will be able to confirm that. So thank you very much.
Our next speaker is Linda Honigman.
Hello, Chair Gutierrez and other committee members. I'm Linda Honigman, and I will be sharing comments from the League of Women Voters of Santa Barbara. We thank you for this time to provide comments on the proposal for a local housing trust fund. As stated in 5 of our letters since October, we viewed the effort to establish such a fund from last year's budget surplus as a meaningful step towards planning for and building deed-restricted housing that will support our low and moderate income residents and workers. Such a fund is urgently needed to leverage state and federal subsidies, generate sizable matching philanthropic donations, and to initiate projects early in the RENA Cycle 6. We agree with the city's housing authority that it is critical to identify permanent sources of funding for the Housing Trust Fund that could replace former redevelopment agency support in order to respond to the growing threat of our housing crisis. We have several recommendations. One, the $2.85 million balance that was allocated by the council last December should be placed in the new fund as soon as possible with any interest that was earned. We would also like to have a more complete explanation about the discrepancy between the initial funding, $3.5 million, and the current balance. We know there was the allocation to help with tenant protections, but that would only be $250,000 of it. 2, the use of funds should be limited to housing that ensures the prioritization of local residents and workers of low and moderate incomes with deed restrictions for at least 90 years. 3, like the Housing Authority, we believe that a program administered within the city of Santa Barbara rather than a county entity will ensure consistency with city plans and goals. We look forward to following the development of this important resource for the city of Santa Barbara. Thank you.
Next speaker is Gabe Escobedo.
Good afternoon, committee members. Gabe Escobedo. I too just want to endorse everything that Leslie Wiscombe shared, so I'm not going to go through all the same bullet points. But I did want to express extreme gratitude to staff, both in the city attorney's office and community development. I think we've seen progress through each iteration, and it's a huge shout out to staff to get to this point, and also to the Housing Authority, a trusted partner of the city. And I would encourage us as we move through this process to continue to work with the Housing Authority. I think they understand this process and what is needed to develop truly affordable housing, and they're the best source of information and a huge resource for the city. I also want to thank you in not rushing this process and going with the first couple iterations that came to you all, and also provided the opportunity for the public to really engage with you all at the last ordinance committee meeting. I think that was really productive. I think that was a huge step to get to here today, and I think you owe yourselves a lot of credit for that, and I appreciate the leadership on this. A couple pieces of feedback that were reiterated, but I think I want to underscore them is I think it makes a lot of sense. The money that you set aside, the $2.85 million plus whatever interest it's accrued, goes into this Affordable Housing Trust Fund to kick it off and get us those funds so that we can apply in the fall. To Councilmember Jordan's question, it is once a year that there is a notice of funding availability, and so it's typically in the spring, and notices for awarding of funds happens in August. Next, I would say please recommend to Finance Committee that they identify an ongoing source. It makes sense in lieu fees in the short term. If there are additional funds that we can identify that make us more competitive for some of these grants that we can get from the state, the better. I think Finance Committee, it makes a lot of sense that they're the body that takes a look at that, but I think an endorsement from you to identify those funds will go a long way. And then finally, with the Santa Barbara County Trust Funds proposal, I too agree that I think this needs to stay in the city. I think when we project out into hopefully next year, when we're going to go to the voters and possibly ask for funding for affordable housing, there's going to be a threshold of transparency and trust needed in order for us to get that across the finish line. I think one way that we can do that is by keeping it in-house at the City of Santa Barbara. It allows us to report regularly at city council meetings to the public about where those funds are going, how they're being spent, and the effectiveness of that ballot measure. And so with that, I want to express thank you again, and well done. Thank you.
Our final speaker will be Frank Rodriguez.
Thank you, Chair Gutierrez and committee members. I want to echo the thank you to you all and to city staff, the city attorney, for the diligent work and thoughtfulness in this process. We're super excited that we're really being thoughtful on the housing element, on how we're going to bring affordable, capital A affordable housing stock in our community. And this has been alongside strengthening kind of tenant protections here in our community, which we know has been so important because we really believe in development without displacement. We want to make sure that people are able to be housed in their community. But in the long run of this kind of equation, we need to make sure we have that capital A affordable housing stock. So really thank you for that. I want to just echo we do want it to be focused here in the city of Santa Barbara, like everyone has said, but really appreciate the thoughtful input from the League of Women Voters and following the lead of our local housing authority. Thank you.
Okay, now I'd like to open the floor up to my colleagues for comments and motions. Councilmember Jordan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Tops on my questions, I think, to hear about more as this goes forward for discussion is the tax advantaged opportunities for employer groups and what that would mean in terms of setting up a public only or maybe two different trust funds, a public and a charitable nonprofit, and what that strategy looks like. There's certainly lots of conversations out there, particularly in the hospitality industry, of the link between hotels and low-wage employees, whether existing or new. And I think that that discussion is starting to track with the employers as a group. And if that was a conversation to have with them and be ready for the same as a public one, but the only difference was it's a charitable one and operates the same way, but it offers a tax-advantaged basis, that would be great. And then just a couple thoughts to add to the mix. I think the annual inclusionary fees are just way too puny to depend upon for anything. I've never been impressed with them in 20 years sitting around up here. And so it needs to be something more than that. Where that comes from will be a fun discussion, I think. And whether the 2.8 goes into this initially, or even if it's one or two trusts, however that works too, but just that 2.8 number, I really interested in going into that, having a discussion where our eyes are wide open, because I don't think we have renewal funding for the right to counsel or rental assistance or anything else like that. And should that, if we just want to turn the corner next year and be ready for the equivalent of a second version of the Hope Fund that's separate from this, do we need to worry about where we're going to get the money now, or do you want to worry about where we're going to get the money then? And nothing I've seen about then looks very pleasant. If there's anything I've had driven into my mind over the last week and a half, that's that the importance of the right to counsel and just what our role could or should be in rental rights outreach. We have some work to do there, and usually when you say you have some work to do there, we need more money. So that's my thoughts there. I also, the 55 years versus 90 years, I guess I'm concerned at like 90 years, you're like, before the 90 years, you're knocking the building down because the building's done. I mean, so what is the period of time you can actually burden an owner or operator on that building to keep up a building before it literally becomes a merit or historic building and you're just keeping it alive for that reason? So what are the pros and cons there for 55 versus 90? I mean, at 55, is it ready to be knocked down and started over again? Or is it viable to go to 90 years and still be able to keep up a rental apartment building? I don't know. I'd like to see one of those in Santa Barbara, a 100-year-old one, and see what that looks like. And definite yes to finding a way to make ADUs, either one of them, conform to whatever we're deciding today too. So if I'm ready to put one in my backyard and I want to use this, I think I should be under the same burden as the rest of the program, such as for rental apartment housing. So whatever those years are, the wage or income qualifiers, that type of thing. And just, you know, I'm referencing our outreach in terms of having been at 215 Bath over the weekend, handing out flyers for an eviction of a 52-unit, a starting eviction process of a 52-unit apartment building. And sometimes I even channel Doss Williams, Supervisor Williams. Happens now and then, and I'll tell you the 2 times it's happened to me. Once was when our favorite state senator, Scott Wiener, was here for a housing conference, and one of Doss's comments was that our historical housing policy in the region has been a war against our children, and that's certainly true, certainly true. And the other most recent time, there's been moments in between. I just play with Doss that way, but the most recent time I was at a Chamber State of the County event last week where Doss talked about housing, and he made the point, which is totally true, that all threads lead back to housing in this community, whether it's local economic vitality, whether it's jobs and employees that you can get, whether it's environmental protections, because we have far too many. I think Peter Rupert said 52% of the employees in the city of Santa Barbara are driving in from farther away than Carpinteria or Goleta. So that's Ventura and Buellton kind of thing, or Lompoc. And so there are even environmental benefits to increased and more dense housing, and in particular, obviously, that would be all the strata. And basically, it's just the damage or the carnage it does to the community, to community people, or lack thereof, because people are either housing insecure, don't have housing, can't find housing, can't afford their housing, or they're driving an hour plus twice a day to go back and forth and not being part of this community. So this will start to be, I hope, something that moves to remedy all that and recognize that it's not just about helping somebody have housing, it's also about all these other things in the community that also suffer just because of the lack of housing in general, but in particular the lower income wage earners' access to housing. So thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Councilmember Jordan. Councilmember Sneddon?
Thank you. I really just first, we've said it, public commenters said it too, but to see this take shape and from over a year ago, from the sort of initial movement on this, it's really exciting, and I think this can make a really big difference in our community, and I think it's been asked for by the community, and I'm really happy today to be moving forward with this. For the funding source, I also agree with the initial starting amount. Actually, could you answer that question about the and interest or 3.5 or the discrepancy or how we come to the 2883548 number?
Thank you, Chair Gutierrez and Councilmember Sneddon. Actually, when council decided this allocation, there was a lot of discussion, and it ended up to be percentages of how the pot was going to be split. And so our finance director, Mr. DiMartini, gave us the final figure after all of those percentages were split up.
Thank you. So you're reminding me that. So some of that went to right to counsel, some of that went to other, and then this was the figure that was left in that. Okay.
Correct.
And then the question of interest, I've had that, people have asked me that outside of today's meeting. Did that accrue interest in the time it's been sitting aside?
Chair Gutierrez, Councilmember Seddon, so that money is in the general fund. I think it's been sort of reserved for a use like this, but a fund has not yet been created. Therefore, it is, I believe, and this is a better question answered by our finance director, but I believe it is accruing interest. I am not as clear as to whether the action council took appropriating these funds address the question of interest. And so that may need to be revisited by council at some point as to make a determination if that would be included in the, what has become 2.8 and change $million.
Thank you. So I think for simplicity, I would just say the initial start with 2.9 million already allocated by council, and then that, I don't know, might be more, might be less, but it's a nicer number to say than the 2883548. So if we made that 2.9 to get started, and then to prioritize the inclusionary in lieu fees, which frankly, we've been collecting them and they don't really have a suitable place to go. There isn't really a process. So it seems to me that this would be a really great use for those funds as the additional funding source, the sustainable funding source on that. And then I would like finance, if we could make a recommendation to specifically consider TOT or sales tax as an ongoing funding source. As Councilmember Jordan mentioned too, there is a sort of clear nexus between the need for housing and the hospitality industry, but I think finance would be the proper place to explore the TOT sales tax discussion. I'd like to recommend the title to be the City of Santa Barbara Local Affordable Housing Trust Fund. I don't know if we have a name. Can you see any reason not to add the word affordable to that title if it's for this fund? Maybe Ms. Connect?
Not right off the top, I don't see a problem with that, as long as HCD is okay with adding that, because it's not in the statutory titles, but.
Then I'll leave it off, because I want this to be as simple as possible.
Okay.
So
It's
I like
City
to.
of Santa Barbara Local Housing Trust
City
Fund.
of Santa Barbara Local Housing Trust Fund. And then I think that makes it very clear what we're talking about, if we are talking about any type of tax or finance committee or anything with the community, it makes it really clear. I'd like to stay with a recommendation for a deed restriction of 90 years. We can come back to that when it comes back as an ordinance, and maybe there's input on the 55 or the 90 years. I also recommend keeping this, if we can, prioritizing the local workforce. So looking into how that can be prioritized. I'm hesitant still and would want more information on the ADU or junior ADU. It just seems there may be complications there that I wouldn't want this to slow that down. So I think when it comes back, maybe we would have more information on that. And then we've discussed a couple different, the tax advantaged opportunities for employee groups, or other, in the Housing Authority letter also, other funds for expanding to other designations beyond the 120% AMI, or programs. And I would just recommend that those be considered for another fund, or those types of partnerships, or anything that might make this not go through smoothly and be clear and work with HCD. I think we can talk about those as additional programs or separate programs. So do you need a motion now, or do you want to finish comments first?
Yeah, we're open to motions right now, if you like.
I think I would make a motion then for the, that the ordinance committee consider, let's see, is the recommendation on slide 20? I want to use the wording you have there, but just add a few words.
Could staff put back the slide that has the recommendation on it, perhaps?
I have it in front of me, I can say it out loud too. So then I would move that we direct staff to agendize for Finance Committee consideration of a dedicated source of funding and matching funds with the recommendation of the initial starting amount of 2.9 already allocated from council and prioritizing additional ongoing funds of the inclusionary in lieu fees, and with direction to Finance Committee to explore specifically TOT and/or sales tax as an ongoing funding. Also recommend the title for the fund to be the City of Santa Barbara Local Housing Trust Fund. And that the fund, and that Finance Committee also consider increasing in lieu fees. And that we recommend local workforce as priority.
Councilmember Sen, the request that the Finance Committee consider increasing in lieu fees?
You don't want that one? Okay. I'll leave that one out.
Thank you.
Okay, but maybe that's a comment that
That
could be
something
noted.
you could direct staff in a separate motion. You could direct staff to consider
Okay.
that as an ordinance. That's
I'll
a little
strike that. I don't want
outside that.
anything
Okay,
that makes
thank you.
anything complicated. And then return to Ordinance Committee for consideration of the ordinance to establish the local housing trust fund.
Okay. Motion by Councilmember Sneddon, seconded by Councilmember Jordan, and Councilmember Jordan has comments.
Just a comment I know was made when we were talking about the first iteration of this, and I'll just make the comment because there's got like 12 more discussions going forward on this anyhow. But the talk was then about the decision point for the use of these funds in projects and who would approve that. And my opinion is that these projects and process should be overseen by council and approved by council rather than just happen in the background at a staff level. So somebody will read this or hear this, and there's 3 more opportunities to discuss that at least, but that's just a point I wanted to make sure was out there.
Do you want me to read it? Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to read what I have. Please correct me if need be. So we have it moved by Councilmember Sneddon, seconded by Councilmember Jordan. The recommendation that Ordinance Committee consider establishing a local housing trust fund as described in the attached memorandum. Direct staff to agendize for Finance Committee consideration of a dedicated source of funding and matching funds as required, and with the recommendation of the initial starting amount of 2.9 million, and with the direction to Finance Committee to explore TOT and sales tax as ongoing funding, and return to Ordinance Committee for consideration of an ordinance to establish a local housing trust fund, with the additional recommendation to name the fund City of Santa Barbara Local Housing Trust Fund.
Thank you. So just before the line that said TOT or sales tax was to prioritize inclusionary in lieu fees as dedicated, the starting dedicated funding source. And if the motion just started at direct staff to agendize, as opposed to, I think what you read started with
The Ordinance Committee.
Ordinance Committee consider, yeah, so
Okay,
it
so
just
we
starts
will
with, yeah.
move by Councilmember Sneddon, seconded by Councilmember Jordan, to direct staff to consider establishing a local housing trust fund as described in the attached memorandum. Direct staff to agendize for Finance Committee consideration of a dedicated source of funding and matching funds as required, and with the recommendation of the initial starting amount of 2.9 million and the direction to staff to prioritize inclusionary in lieu fees as a dedicated funding source. We also will ask Finance Committee to explore TOT and sales tax as ongoing funding and return to Ordinance Committee for consideration of an ordinance to establish a local housing trust fund, and also recommend that the name of the fund is City of Santa Barbara Local Housing Trust Fund.
Thank
Did
you.
I
So
get it?
just one more little thing, and it's just little, it's at the beginning there. It just starts with direct staff to agendize for Finance Committee a dedicated source of funding and matching funding. So just to be clear, we're not directing finance to come up with the ordinance. We're just directing them, we're, I think, supporting the ordinance, and we're just directing them to look at the funding source.
Okay. Can I do a roll call? Do you have that clear?
I think everyone understands the motion, yes?
Okay. Councilmember Jordan,
Yes.
Councilmember Sneddon,
Yes.
and Chair Gutierrez.
Aye.
Thank you.
So that passes unanimously. Unless there's anything else from my colleagues, I'll adjourn this meeting. Thank you.